My name is Mark Peters. I'm an international motivational speaker. I do a talk about my life. For 20 years, I was a photojournalist for Newsweek Magazine. I've covered 16 wars. I've been sentenced to death twice. I talk about my life with Nelson Mandela. I was present the day he walked out of prison. I got the first picture of him to go around the world. Everybody knew his name, but nobody knew his face. At the age of 23, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was tired of being in and out of the army in Rhodesia. So I decided to go down to Cape Town in South Africa. Once I arrived in Cape Town, I had nowhere to live. I looked up at the mountain and I thought, well, I can go live on the mountain. And for the next year, as a homeless person, I lived on Table Mountain. During that year, living on the mountain, I discovered what I really wanted to do, and that was to be a newspaper photographer. I was fortunate enough to see an opening at my hometown, Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. And I went back and I started at the Bulawayo Chronicle. Probably the best training you could get because there was a war going on. So in the morning, I did old ladies' tea parties, and in the afternoon, murdered nuns. I spent 3 years getting good at my craft. I noticed that the cracks in the Apartheid war were appearing in South Africa. And I wanted to cover that story. I wanted to be there when the Apartheid wall fell down. So I transferred to the Star in Johannesburg, where I spent another 3 years getting the feel of the country. I then went freelance. I worked for Associated Press, Newsweek Magazine, all the big newspapers around the world, London Times, LA Times, New York Times, Boston Globe. And for the next decade, I covered, which was the 80s, I covered township unrest. During that period, I have a few stories that I tell. One is helping an old lady get to safety. The mob wanted to kill her. And myself being sentenced to death by a mob. Newsweek Magazine hired me as a contract photographer. The Apartheid wall started to fall down. F.W. de Klerk, who was president of South Africa, announced the release of Nelson Mandela. The story I talk about is how I got the first picture of Nelson Mandela to be transmitted around the world as he walked out of prison. Newsweek Magazine was the first magazine in the world to have Mandela on the cover. They held the presses for the second time in their history. The first time was the end of the Second World War. I also go into detail about my few journeys that I had with Mr. Mandela. He went back to visit his prison cell on Robben Island. He took 40 journalists, 20 foreign, 20 local. And he walked straight to me and he said, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm fine." And then he looked at me and said, "Do you remember me?" And I said to him, "Sorry, what's your name again?" And he laughed, he put his arm around, and I was the first journalist that he took into his prison cell. He then put me on a ticker parade. He put me on a car behind him on a ticker parade in New York. The next morning I walked into the Oval Office to meet the President of the United States with Mr. Mandela. Mr. Mandela's been to my house for Sunday lunches, and I've had many a lunch with Mr. Mandela. They've all got lovely little stories to them. Now that Nelson Mandela was released, I found myself being used by Newsweek to go and cover wars around the world. And I talk about a few incidents in the wars. I did 16 wars. I've seen man's inhumanity to his fellow man. I don't talk about the wars too much, but I talk about a few situations that I think are very interesting. One of them being the Gulf War, where I took the first photograph of a pilot to ignite the air war with his thumbs up in the cockpit. That picture now hangs in the Hall of Heroes at the Pentagon and was turned into a Silver Air Force medal. I've done all the wars in Africa, the Balkans, Israel, Afghanistan, to name a few. I end my talk with 3 stories. One is Mother Teresa, when she came to Cape Town, and we had a meeting, just her and I, sitting on a bench in a church garden. And there's a lovely story behind that. I then go to the second last story, which is I was on my way to Timbuktu. And if it wasn't for a little herd boy and a bottle of Coca-Cola, I wouldn't be here today. That little boy saved my life, and I tell that story. And my final story is Frank Sinatra was opening Sun City, a hotel complex. And this is his final practice. As it ended, I was walking away and he said, I owe you a song. There's a story why. And I sat in the middle row, front row, middle seat, and he's saying, I did it my way. And that's what I've done. I've done my life my way. I've flown Concorde. I got to the top of that mountain. From the bottom, being homeless, I got to the top of that mountain. I've been invited to Buckingham Palace on 2 occasions for lunch and dinner. But one thing I've done is I've followed my passion. And I think if you follow your passion, if it's your hobby, you can only but succeed. You can't go wrong. If I can do it, everybody else can do it. I'm not special, man. I just did it my way. Thank you, Frank Sinatra.